So it's my great pleasure to introduce the winner of the second annual Stephen Jay Gould Award. The Stephen Jay Gould Prize is awarded annually by the Society for the Study of Evolution to recognize individuals whose sustained and exemplary efforts have advanced public understanding of evolutionary science and its importance in biology, education, and everyday life in the spirit of Stephen Jay Gould. The winner of the 2010 Gould Prize is Sean Carroll. Dr. Carroll has had a distinguished career both advancing the science of evolution and in conveying that knowledge to the general public. This breadth is exemplified by his 6 books, including The Making of the Fittest, which won the Phi Beta Kappa 2007 Science Book Award, and his latest book, Remarkable Creatures, Epic Adventures in the Search of the Origins of Species. That was a finalist for the 2009 National Book Award in Nonfiction. He has served as a consulting producer for the public broadcasting system program NOVA, as well as numerous appearances on other shows on PBS, the Discovery Channel, BBC, television and radio, and National Public Radio. These efforts have made him a leading spokesperson in the public sphere for evolutionary biology. Dr. Carroll's scientific research is at the intersection of the disciplines of evolution and development. He is currently professor of molecular biology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he has been since 1987. He has authored more than 130 peer-reviewed papers and has received numerous honors for his scientific achievements, including fellowships in the National Academies of Science and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and is serving as the president for the Society of Developmental Biology. His classroom achievements have been honored with a Distinguished Service Award from the National Association of Biology Teachers, and for all of these reasons, it is extremely fitting that this year, Dr. Carroll is the recipient of this award. So, please.
I don't know who he's talking about. I want to meet that guy, Carroll. Needs a hobby. Thank you, Sam, for that very kind introduction and nice citation. Thanks to the Society for this honor from fellow evolutionary biologists. It really means a lot. Thanks to the organizers for putting on this meeting. I think this is the first all-hands gathering in the meeting. Just look around, folks. I don't know how many are in the room, but what, maybe 1,200 evolutionary biologists? That'd make some people quake in their boots. And it's like 1,800 or 1,900 at the meeting. What a great sign for the field. And thank you all for attending tonight, including people from the general community. And if you, I'm just curious, please don't be shy. If you're not an attendee of the meeting, but you're here tonight, will you raise your hand? I just want to look out. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. And I do have kind of some bad news, good news. The bad news, as I said, there's almost 2,000 evolutionary biologists here, so you're all going to hell. But the good news is hell is full of some really smart, interesting people. So it means a great deal to me that this award is given in the spirit of Stephen Jay Gould, because that spirit really had a lot to do with my becoming an evolutionary biologist. As a student, reading Gould's columns and books made me aware of important open questions in evolutionary biology that I decided to try to pursue. And his infectious enthusiasm for all things in natural history whet my appetite and really made my last 3 decades, oh my God, I can't even say that, journey so much more rewarding. And you know, that's a nice, citation of all this, but you got to understand that when a scientist steps up to receive any kind of honor, there's sort of a lie in the whole thing, which is nobody does this anywhere, but not only by themselves, but not even close. besides mentors, besides the communities that raise us and the tremendous interchange that happens in the scientific community to make all of our work possible, I've had the great thrill of working with fantastic students, postdocs, and staff in my lab for the last 23 years at Wisconsin. None of this would have happened without their mighty efforts, creativity, talent, patience, tolerance, and nor would I have had the creative freedom to pursue the things that interested me in science, or to pursue the realm of science communication without the generous long-term support, in particular, of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. And for those people and for those institutions, I'm forever grateful. To those of you who are on the younger side of the spectrum here, just imagine having the chance to really do everything you imagined you wanted to do and more. So you're looking at a really lucky guy. So I thought the best way to show my gratitude is to share with you the single most important thing I've learned about communicating science in any setting. And I wish somebody had told me this a long time ago. So for the benefit of younger scientists and those who are curious, here's the big secret. It's all about storytelling. And what I mean by that is we know that humans, we like stories. That's what we tell each other in the pub. That's what we tell each other at night at the dinner table. That's why we go to movies. That's why we read books. That's why we listen to songs, etc. Science is no different. Rudyard Kipling, who certainly knew a thing or two about writing memorable stories, said that, quote, if history were taught in the form of stories, it would never be forgotten. And I'm sure that's certainly true of science. So whether teaching our students, talking with the public, talking with each other, it's all about storytelling. And Stephen Jay Gould was a great storyteller. And his writings made me appreciate and inspired a deeper interest in the rich, colorful story of our science. So tonight, in the spirit of Stephen Jay Gould, I'm going to tell you some stories, and I hope you'll find them memorable. So, the search for the origins of species, both in general and of specific kinds of creatures. I'm going to go to, you got the lav mic right? I'm going to get away from the podium. We're good? No, we're not good. We're good? There we go. Too many buttons. Okay. So that search for the origin of species, both in general and specific kinds of creatures, has entailed a series of truly epic adventures over the past 200 years. And I had a fabulous time chronicling some of those in a recent book. What I want to do tonight is share with you some of those adventures and really celebrate the explorers who undertook them. And I think the author C.W. Saron really got it right when he defined adventure as a mixture of spirit and deed. And my hope tonight is that you will come away inspired by these folks' great spirit and with a much greater appreciation for the magnitude of their deeds. Now, throughout all of last year, the whole world celebrated the achievements of Charles Darwin, no doubt our greatest naturalist and the leader of a far-reaching scientific revolution. And my talk tonight is in part a continuation of that party, but my agenda is a little broader than that. Darwin's voyage and his work are generally fairly well known, and rightfully so. But the making of the theory of evolution and its early growth and traction owes a considerable debt to two other men, Alfred Wallace and Henry Walter Bates, who undertook even longer voyages under even more difficult circumstances than Darwin. Now, all three of these men had various things in common. They were all young Englishmen when they went out on these great adventures. They are all desperate to leave gray, rainy, cloudy England for the glories of the tropics, or at least what they had read about from some earlier explorers about the tropics. They were prodigious collectors, really as adolescent boys, and they sort of felt they had exhausted what England had to offer, so they all three dreamt of going to faraway places and collecting the riches of those things. In fact, they were such prodigious collectors that I think they had some form of OCD, sort of obsessive collecting disorder, because for the rest of their lives, they collected and pickled and pinned and labeled virtually every creature they came across. But it really was from that enormous effort that each man developed an appreciation for the variety, the variation that each individual species exhibited. And it was from that very hard-earned knowledge that each man was led to unique insights about nature. So what I want to do tonight is have us walk in the footsteps of these three pioneers, and particularly to focus on how the creatures that they encountered led them to their respective discoveries. And their voyages and discoveries mark truly an initial golden age of evolutionary biology. And then in the last few minutes of my talk, I want to briefly explain why I think right now we're living in a second golden age of evolutionary science. Now, no one's experiences better fit that description of spirit and deed than Alfred Wallace. So my tales tonight are going to begin with Wallace and the Amazon. Now, Wallace had a series of motives for going to the Amazon. One, as I said, he really just wanted to collect. He thought exhausted what England had to offer. The second one, quite honestly, was he hated his day job. He had left school at age 13. He was working through a series of jobs. He was fairly fed up. So he suggested to his friend and fellow collector, Henry Walter Bates, that they go to the Amazon to build their own personal natural history collections. There was only one problem. They were both dirt broke. So how were they going to go all the way to South America, let alone pay their expenses, feed themselves, etc.? So they had to come up with a scheme. And the scheme they came up with was that they would collect enough to be able to sell the duplicates back in England to museums or to other collectors. So they set up an arrangement with an agent who would receive shipments from South America, sell them, and send, after, of course, an agent's cut, send them the proceeds back to South America. So they had that all arranged. But Wallace was very well read in terms of both the scientific literature and sort of popular science of the day. And he said explicitly to Bates, let's also go to gather facts towards the problem of the origin of species. Now, what did he mean by that, sort of circa 1847? Well, the question of the origin of species at that time was whether or not species were specially created by God in their present form to live in a particular place for some set period of time, unchanging, immutable, or whether species changed and were subject to natural laws. So, off they went, and they landed on the coast of Brazil in 1848, and they spent about a year right around the area of Para collecting together. And then they split up. They said it was to cover more territory, which I think was just the gentleman's way of saying they were getting on each other's nerves, living in tents, etc., very close quarters, and decided to cover the Amazon separately. Now, we're going to catch up with Bates a little bit later. We're going to follow Wallace for a while. And what Wallace did was, and I can't point at both screens at once, so I'll try to balance the two sides of the room. But what Wallace did was he went up the main trunk of the Amazon, then up the Rio Negro, and up a tributary of the Rio Negro, such that by 1852, he was 2,000 miles upriver. Okay? Farther than any European had ever gone. And he was wiped out. He was laid up for about 3 months with either malaria, yellow fever, or both. He was completely exhausted. You can imagine travel in that day was very difficult, extremely slow. Food was scarce. He was working through areas of hostile tribes, swarms of all sorts of insects, dangerous animals, etc. And it was physically arduous, going out every day collecting, then spending the evenings labeling everything, back out the next day, shipping specimens back to England when he could. So 4 years of this, he was spent. Well, he also kind of added to his troubles because he got the idea while he was collecting and pickling all these specimens that wouldn't it be great to show the people back home some of the living treasures of the Amazon. So he also had with him, in small cages, about 30 live animals. He had a woolly monkey, he had a macaw, he had a toucan, and he had to feed them all every day by hand. Okay? I can barely watch TV with a cold, let alone, take care of animals in the middle of the Amazon. So he really reached the conclusion if he didn't turn around and head back, he was going to die in the jungle. So he gathered up his animals, and he started making his way downriver. Now, he was so far upriver that he had to store lots of crates of specimens to be picked up later. He couldn't get them all back to the coast of Brazil. So he had to collect all these specimens, start making his way back, 2,000 miles. And he makes his way back all the way to the coast of Para. Now he has to find a boat heading home. He finds an old brig called the Helen that's headed for England, secures a berth on it, loads in his live animals, loads in crates and crates of specimens, and sets sail for England. Now, after 4 years in the jungle, he just starts thinking about, oh, goodness, I'm going to have a warm bed every night. You know, bread and butter, little things that you might miss after 4 years in the jungle. Well, I guess what happened next, I'm going to let Wallace tell you. He was about 700 miles east of Bermuda, about 4 weeks into the trip, when the captain came to his cabin and said, I'm afraid the ship's on fire. Come and see what you think of it. Now, you're laughing heartily, but there's a lot of field biologists in this audience. That's not kind to laugh at other people's misery. Okay. So, now Wallace was really still just recovering his strength, so he's sort of in a fog. And he gets up out of his cabin, and he follows the captain to the hold, and sure enough, the hold is smoldering, and Wallace realizes it can erupt into flames at any moment. There's not much time. He races back to his cabin. All he has time to do is grab a small tin box, and he stuffs a few shirts in it and some drawings he had done of some Amazonian fish. In fact, this very drawing. And he makes his way to the lifelines that lead down to the lifeboats. So with a box in hand, he's working his way down the ropes. He slips, burns his hands going down the ropes into the salt water. Yeah, I just absorbed that for a second, okay? Paddles over to the lifeboat, climbs in, and realizes it's leaking. And just has to start bailing. And he turns in time to see the Helen burst into flames. And from that open lifeboat, bobbing in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, he sees the boat become completely consumed and sink to the bottom of the ocean with all of his collections and all of his animals. My collections, however, were in the hold, and all the reward of my 4 years of privation and danger were lost. Now, he couldn't dwell too long on what he had lost. He's in an open lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic in 1852, okay? Survival is the issue, and it was rough. Day after day, we continued in the boats. We were scorched by the sun, my hands, nose, and ears being completely skinned, and drenched every day by the seas and spray. We were constantly wet, had no comfort at night. We had a short allowance of water, which left us constantly thirsty. Actually, this shipwreck was memorialized about 30 years later in the book. That's where you're getting the picture. It's not a photograph. And I have to think that at some point, bobbing in that lifeboat, the thought might have occurred to Wallace, how did I get in this predicament? And really, if you remember, that one of his major motivations for going to South America was to gather facts towards the problem of the origin of species. If he was going to blame anybody else for the situation he was in, well, he'd blame this guy, Charles Darwin. And the reason is that unknown to Wallace, Darwin already knew the answer to the mystery of origins. He just hadn't told anybody. He knew from a voyage that he had taken 15 years earlier, the chronicle of which is this book, which we now refer to as the Voyage of the Beagle. He knew 15 years earlier. Just didn't say so. So how do we know Darwin knew, and what did he know? Oh, look, you all know something about Darwin, but let's just for a few minutes retrace a couple of the key stops on his voyage. Remind you that this 22-year-old divinity student left on what he thought was going to be a 2-year voyage just after Christmas 1831. And one of the more fruitful stops in terms of the discoveries he would make was on the coast of Argentina in both 1832 and lasting into 1833. The Beagle would make multiple stops at the same place. And it was there, on the coast of Argentina near Bahia Blanca, that Darwin discovered lots of fossils eroding out from the cliff face. And he found skulls, jaws, vertebrae, teeth, and was eventually figured out, he created a lot of these up, sent them off to England for identification. It was eventually figured out that he found representatives of 7 different mammals. But what was remarkable about them was that they were all huge, so-called megafauna. All mammals, as I said. Things like this ground sloth that hadn't been found before, so it was actually named after Darwin. It would just tower over me. And this big thing like Toxodon, about a sort of a hippo or rhino-sized mammal, far larger than anything that was on the continent, living at the time. And Darwin started to puzzle. Now, these are bigger than the sloths and llamas and things that he was seeing, so he started to think about the geological relations between the extinct and the living. The animals he was finding that were clearly gone, that were buried in the ground, and the animals that were walking around South America. Just a little seed planted in the back of his now 24-year-old mind. But this was already 2 years into the voyage. They were still on the east coast of South America. He realized this was not going to be just a 2-year voyage. And he wrote home, in fact, and said, I know not how will I endure it. But he did endure it. You may know that Darwin never got over his seasickness, so every day on the Beagle, on the open ocean, was a bit of a trial. But he endured it. And how did he endure it? Well, he didn't know what was going to be around the next corner. He didn't know what they were going to find the next time the Beagle pulled into port. And maybe he hopped on a horse and ran it and rode off into the highlands. And he was just, couldn't abandon that possibility, couldn't give up the voyage. So he stuck with it, day after day, week after week, month after month, even year after year, till finally in the 4th year, the Beagle finally made its way up the west coast of South America. And Darwin found a second important batch of evidence for his thinking. Made their way to the Galapagos Islands. Now, you all know about the Galapagos, but you may not know that, in fact, in letters home, Darwin was pretty excited about going to the Galapagos, but he wasn't thinking about the creatures of the Galapagos. He was looking forward to seeing the volcanoes. Darwin had been steeped in geology at Cambridge. He considered himself a geologist. He was pretty good at field geology. This was his first chance to see volcanoes, so he was all excited. What he found when he got there was giant tortoises, ocean-going lizards. I mean, who had heard of such a thing? The sailors of the Beagle called them imps of darkness. And some really, humdrum-looking birds like this mockingbird. Naturalist paradise? No way. Reptile paradise, maybe. But Darwin thought immediately, writes in his notebook, this place smells terrible. It's unbearably hot, reaching perhaps 130 degrees on some of the black rock. He's really eager to keep on moving. They spend 5 weeks in the Galapagos going island to island, and Darwin's collecting. But by the time they're leaving the Galapagos, he's really looking forward to their next major port of call, which is Tahiti. British sailors were fond of Tahiti. Go ahead and, go watch Mutiny on the Bounty. You'll know why. Okay. So he's thinking about Tahiti, and he did enjoy the sail to Tahiti, much calmer waters, saw his first coral reefs. And, of course, it was on to Australia, and after Australia, on to Africa. And then all that had to happen was for that Beagle to turn up the west coast of Africa, and he'd be home. Now, when he was on the Galapagos, he had collected, he had noticed some things like, these are a few different kinds of mockingbirds he found on different islands. But it was only many months later he realized their significance. It was when the captain of the Beagle decided, no, not to turn home after leaving Africa, but just to go recheck some measurements in South America and to sail back across the Atlantic again. So he did happen to hook up with Captain Fitzroy, probably the most obsessive captain in the history of the British Navy. And Darwin, when he realized he was going to be months more at sea, wrote home and said, I abhor the sea and all ships which sail on it. But he's stuck. He's stuck on board the ship, and he realizes he's got to make some good use of his time. And he decides, a lot of his notes were made in haste. Right? They're made at camp at night or swinging in a hammock on the Beagle, etc. And he didn't have very nice handwriting. And his plan was that of all the specimens he collected, which were fossils, plants, animals, minerals, sand, just about anything he could stuff in a bottle or a jar, is that he was going to rely on the experts back in England to sort of sort it out. Of course, for them to do their work, they had to know where this stuff was collected and have Darwin's full notes. So he decided to start retranscribing his rough field notes into more orderly notes. And he started working on his birds. And in his ornithology notebook on the sail home, he started thinking back about these mockingbirds. And he had his first eureka moment. So this is an actual page from Darwin's notebook, and those of you sitting up close can see it. I don't have a better copy of this. It's kind of yellow paper now, but fortunately all these documents are in the possession, most of these at the Cambridge University Library. And Darwin thinks about these mockingbirds, different types in different islands, and he thinks, when I see these islands in sight of each other and possessed of but a scanty stock of animals, tenanted by these birds but slightly differing in structure and filling the same place in nature, I must suspect they are only varieties. If there's the slightest foundation for these remarks, the zoology of archipelagos will be well worth examining, for such facts would undermine the stability of species. Undermine the stability of species. Species would be changing. This thought infects his mind. This is not what he was taught at Cambridge, which was the stability, the immutability of species. He's now thinking, he's looking at evidence, these slightly different birds on different islands, that species change. So by the time he arrives home, he enters a phase he refers to as mental rioting, where he's gripped with this idea, keeps a series of pocket notebooks in his jacket pocket, and really, in stream of consciousness fashion, is just jotting down thoughts that occur to him about species and about all the things that he had seen on his voyage around the world. I just want to show you a few of those entries. In a notebook being composed the next year in 1837, on one page he says, we may look at Megatherium, which is another extinct giant ground sloth, armadillos and sloths as all offsprings of some still older type. So he's starting to think about the succession of life over time, that those animals buried in the ground are, the living animals today are the offspring of something that's still older. And those animals in the ground are the offspring of something even still older. And he thinks, on the next page he says, organized beings, they represent a tree irregularly branched. Some branches far more branched, more species, and as many terminal buds dying, going extinct, as new ones generated. And then he thinks about where he saw various animals. And he thinks, it's funny, I saw lots of sloths in South America, but I didn't see them in Australia or Africa. I saw kangaroos in Australia. I didn't see kangaroos in South America. So he says, I think that the similarity of animals in one country, sloths in South America, extinct sloths in South America, that's going to the springing from one branch in this tree. And then to express this idea on the next page, he makes a little drawing. The most famous drawing in natural history, because it's an entirely new system of natural history. An explanation for the origin of species that's as natural as the explanation of children being descended from their parents and their parents from grandparents. That species are the natural offspring of previous species and so forth back in time. But he's not going to share this with anybody. This is heresy. This is absolutely against what he was taught at Cambridge by mentors, I should point out, for whom he had very fond feelings. Mentors who he maintained correspondence with, people like Reverend Henslow, throughout the whole voyage, and really bucked Darwin's courage up. We're introducing him to the leading lights of British science at this time. It would be like spitting in their face. He kept it to himself. He kept thinking about this. The mental rioting continued. In the next year, well done, yes. If you get this right, I'm going to say at the same time, ready? The next year, he thought of natural selection. Which I'll talk about in a couple minutes. But the process he's going through, and you can see this in his notebooks, this is all private rumination. And you can see he's starting to show some exasperation. This is a page from 1838. I'll show you the transcript in a second. And Darwin's thinking, he's one of the, new men of science. And he's well aware that, the astronomers had overturned our picture of the universe, and geologists had overturned our picture of the changing Earth. Why was life somehow special outside the realm of natural laws? He just couldn't stomach that anymore. And here's the quotes right off the top of the page. He says, we can allow satellites, planets, suns, universes, nay, whole systems of universes to be governed by laws. But the smallest insect we wish to be created at once by special act. He just didn't see the logic here. Why would all the heavens be organized by natural laws, but every little beetle, and this is a guy that collected a lot of beetles, every little beetle and every little ant created by special act. Didn't make any sense. But he kept this to himself. He had a golden opportunity to spill the beans, because at the very same time he's having these private thoughts, he's writing, for publication, his account of the voyage of the Beagle, where they went, what he saw, the people he saw, the creatures he saw, the natural phenomena he witnessed, earthquakes, volcanoes, etc. And this is the book. And I show you the frontispiece because if you happen to encounter this book in a used bookstore or something like that, you might want to grab it. It's worth about $100,000. So, in good condition. He's going to get to the Galapagos. What's he going to say? He knows species change. What's he going to write? He's going to dodge it. And here's the dodge. The dodge is, it is clear that if several islands have each their peculiar species of the same genera, when these are placed together, they'll have a wide range of character. The mockingbirds, the finches. But there's not space in this work to enter on this curious subject. That's it. That's all he was going to give up. When Wallace read this years later, time frame now is important. This is published in 1839. Wallace doesn't leave England until 1848. When Wallace reads this, he thinks the great Darwin has left the question, the problem of species, wide open. Now, Darwin didn't leave it here. Darwin actually worked hard on his species theory, wrote a 35-page essay on that in 1842, expanded that to a 230-page work in 1844, complete with a table of contents. And he was now married to his wife Emma, gave it to Emma and said, well, should I die? And he was by now thinking a lot about an early death. You know, please see to it that it's published. It maybe has some value, but he wasn't willing to share it while he was alive. So if Wallace had been privy to any of this, what Darwin thought in 1839, what he thought in 1842, what he thought in 1844, well, goodness, you know, he might not have gone to South America. We might not have heard of Wallace. He might not be in an open lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But Darwin said nothing, so there he was. Now, of course, if Wallace had not been rescued, we wouldn't have heard of Wallace either. So he was rescued. 10 days and 10 nights passed when a vessel was seen, and by night we were on board her, much rejoiced to have escaped a death on the wide ocean, whence none would have ever come to tell the tale. Okay, now I got to disclose where I'm getting all these quotes from Wallace. It's the most remarkable letter I've ever been able to hold, well, through plastic in my little greasy paws. It's a letter that Wallace wrote on board the rescue ship as he was on his way back to England. And he wrote it in various segments because it's a long story to a friend, Richard Spruce, in Brazil, where he tells a story of getting sick, deciding to turn around, making his way all the way back to the coast, finding a boat home, the boat catching fire, being in the open lifeboat, etc. So he's writing this in segments. And fortunately, Spruce saved the letter, okay? So it's now in the Natural History Museum in England. And it's written in sections. So a little bit after telling the tale of being rescued, he says, 50 times since I left Para, the coast of Brazil, have I vowed if I once reached England, never to trust myself on the ocean. And a few days later, in another entry, he says, but good resolutions soon fade. So, despite his loss, his near-death experience, he still had nothing to show for the lands that he had trod. The great question to him of the origin of species was still wide open. So he decided as soon as he could get his affairs in order, get his strength back a little bit, he'd go off again. Spirit and deed. The question he had to face was where to go. And he thought, well, let me see. He has the same problem. He still has to pay his way around the world, so he needs to collect extra specimens. So he's got to go where the collecting is good. And he thinks, well, I won't go to the Amazon. There's probably one good reason for that, but his other reason was Bates has that covered, as though one person could cover the Amazon. But anyway, his old friend Bates was still collecting in the Amazon. But he read some tales from travelers of the Malay Archipelago and decided that might be good hunting. And so in 1854, he set off. And of course, now it's going to be Wallace who's going to flush Darwin out into the open. So in April 1854, Wallace lands in Singapore. And over the course of the next 8 years, he's going to make his way west to east across these islands. And he's going to trust himself to the ocean. He's going to make 96 crossings, island to island, totaling 14,000 miles, and collect more than 1,000 specimens that this time will be secure. Now, when he lands in Singapore, he's got the same challenge as before. He's got to find not just bugs or creatures or whatever. He's got to find things people want, like this. Bird-winged butterflies, named for their giant wingspan, coveted for those luxurious colors on their wings. Now, Wallace, of course, as a paid collector, has to know where to find these things, but he's also paying close attention to where he finds them for other reasons. He notices that as he hops island to island, and here's a sample of bird-winged butterflies he finds, that some of the butterflies are different. These are all bird-winged butterflies. These are original butterflies collected by Wallace that are in the possession of the Natural History Museum in London. Butterflies are slightly different from each other and found on particular islands. These butterflies signal to Wallace just what the birds of the Galapagos signal to Darwin. Slightly different species. Species change. But Wallace has none of the inhibitions that have restrained Darwin now for 16 years, 18 years. So really, as he's making observations, he's dashing off papers, short communications to scientific journals, natural history magazines, whatever. And in this first year in the Malay Archipelago, he conceives of a law and writes a scientific paper. This law is referred to as the Sarawak Law, because he thought of it on the island of Sarawak. Look at the title of the paper. On the law which has regulated the introduction of new species. This is 1855. He's not beating around the bush. Now look at what he has to say. Well, he's thinking about those bird-winged butterflies. And he thinks, I didn't see any bird-winged butterflies in the Amazon. And I don't see any of the kinds of butterflies I saw in the Amazon over here in the Malay Archipelago. So it seems like that the most closely allied species are found in geographical proximity. So I think that every species has come into existence coincident both in space and time with a pre-existing closely allied species. Species from closely allied species. That would explain the pattern of distribution that he's seeing. Oh yes, and one other little nugget buried in this paper. The best way of representing the natural arrangement of species? A branching tree. Remember, nothing that Darwin's been thinking is in print. So what's the reaction to this paper? Published in England in 1855? Nothing. All he hears back is some grumbling. Wallace, remember, he's a pure amateur. Stop your theorizing. Send us some more bird wings. Okay, well, that's what he's got to do. So he keeps traveling. And remember, this area is not well known to Western explorers, so he has to rely on a lot of the local expertise, like in the case of Borneo, like the Dayaks of Borneo, a tribe with a ferocious reputation, but of course they're going to know where all the creatures are in the jungle. And it turns out, much to Wallace's benefit, they sort of have let's just say sort of a natural history collecting instinct. Anyway, they're helpful. And that's not Wallace's head, or we would never, okay. So Wallace keeps moving west to east. And really, he has to improvise his travel. There's no scheduled boat service. So he just has to go wherever he can catch a lift. And he's crossing one day, making a really short crossing that was really no interest to him. It was just a way to island hop to some other islands he wanted to get to. And he was crossing from Bali to Lombok, only about 20 miles across the water. But as he got to Lombok and as he went further east, he noticed a complete changeover in the fauna he was looking at. And it really struck him that whereas in the Western islands, like Sumatra, he saw tigers, and Java, he saw rhinoceros, and on Borneo, he saw monkeys and orangutans. When he got to the Eastern islands, like as far out as New Guinea, he saw things like tree kangaroos. I love biology audiences for that. Okay, you like that one? How about a cuscus? This is too easy. Okay. I think the Christian homeschoolers down the hall would have been a little bit more fun. So, and he looks at this pattern and he says, this is really strange. He says, it's almost as though there's a line separating the Western and the Eastern islands, where in the Western islands you see fauna more characteristic of Asia, and in the Eastern islands, things more characteristic of Australia. Tree kangaroos, And these are clearly marsupials, like the well-known kangaroos of Australia. And in fact, this line that Wallace drew, we still refer to today as the Wallace Line. And he thinks, what could explain this distribution of animals? And he's writing a paper again. My Sarawak Law. These are all marsupials. Well, they've come into existence with closely allied other marsupials, closely allied species, and these are all placental mammals. They've come into existence with closely allied placental mammals. And how would I explain this distribution? Well, he doesn't know anything about plate tectonics. He just speculates that, at some point in time, maybe these islands were connected by land bridges or something like that, and that the eastern islands were connected to each other and to Australia, but not to the western islands, and the western islands were connected to mainland Asia. And that what's been going on here is that marsupials have been adapting to the local conditions on these islands. Adapting to local conditions, species changing. He's now convinced that species change. Now he wants to know how. So he keeps working his way west to east, and he gets to this island, Ternate, February 1858. He's laid up. He's wrapped in a blanket on an 88-degree day, baking in a malarial fever, lying in a dilapidated hut. When the answer occurs to him. How do species change? Well, as the fever starts to clear, he jots it down. Stream of consciousness fashion. And remember, this is somebody who spent 4 years in the Amazonian jungle. He's now 4 years in the Malay jungle. And he says, the life of wild animals is a struggle for existence and to provide for their infant offspring. Also remember, this is somebody who's captured lots of specimens of individual species. And he says, perhaps all the variations, because he realizes creatures he's caught are slightly different from one another, members of the same species. Perhaps all these variations must have some definite effect, however slight, in the habits or capacities of the individuals. And a variety having slightly increased powers must inevitably in time acquire a superiority in numbers. And he calls this on the tendency of species to depart indefinitely from the original type. Could have used a marketing course. Now he's feeling a little insecure about this because he's working by himself, far away from the center of science in England. He doesn't want to publish this without a little vetting. So he decides to send this paper to a naturalist with whom he struck up a correspondence the previous year. He sends it to Charles Darwin. Uh-oh. When Darwin receives this, he reads it, he's shocked. He tells a couple confidants, Charles Lyell, Joseph Hooker. He said, Wallace couldn't have written a better abstract of my theory than if he had all my writings before him. So why was Darwin shocked? What I want to show you is what Darwin was working on at the time, actually a year earlier. And this is unpublished manuscript. Again, part of the treasure trove now available on anyone's browser are all the writings, all the drafts, everything we have from Charles Darwin. And this is the big book he was working on, taking him a long time. And let's see what he was working on a year earlier, unbeknownst to Wallace, just as what Wallace was thinking. Darwin didn't know until that letter arrived. Well, he's working on chapter 5, the struggle for existence as bearing on natural selection. Now, what did he say a little bit later? He said, all nature is at war. Remember, this is also somebody who was observing nature up close for 5 years and determined that nature was a battlefield. The struggle very often falls on the egg and seed or on the seedling. And any variation, however infinitely slight, if it did promote during any part of life, even in the slightest degree, the welfare of the being, such variation would tend to be preserved or selected. That, of course, is the definition of natural selection. Look at the language. Struggle for existence. Very slight variation. Neither man knew what the other was thinking. How can we explain this? Well, they had both been to archipelagos and seen slightly different species in different islands. They had both collected a lot of specimens of individual species and noticed that they were slightly variable. They both felt that nature was a battlefield. They saw how tough life was for creatures and especially for offspring. They both read the same social economist, Thomas Malthus, who said that the checks on populations were war, famine, disease, and death, and both reached the conclusion that that was of human populations, that was certainly true, but that would be 100 or 1,000-fold more true in nature. Same fact pattern. Great minds think alike. And I'm just going to interject this for the educators in the audience. You know, this is the shame of Wallace's story not being around and often not being in textbooks at all. That this idea was arrived at independently by two people looking at different sets of evidence. A perfect way to explain how science works. So anyway, Darwin has to decide what to do. And Wallace said, if you thought there was merit in this paper, please pass it on to Charles Lyell for publication. So Darwin did. And Darwin was quite distracted at the time. Scarlet fever had hit the village of Down, and his youngest child, Charles Jr., had acquired it and was quite sick. And so he left the issue of what to do about this in the hands of his friends. And you may know the outcome of that. They decided the best thing to do was to publish Wallace's letter and an excerpt from Darwin together, present them to the Linnean Society, and then publish them in the Society Journal shortly later that summer. And that's what was done. And there's the public debut of the idea of natural selection. July 1st, 1858. Wallace wasn't there. He's thousands of miles away in the Malay Archipelago. He doesn't even know this is taking place. They decided it takes too long to write to Wallace, ask for his permission, et cetera, et cetera. Wallace just said, if you think it's worthy, have it published. So they did. Darwin's not there. That very same day, he's burying Charles Jr. in the family cemetery. He died of scarlet fever. So this is it. This is the public debut. And what's the reaction? Nothing. Got to tell you, folks, people don't always read our papers. I now have the gray hair where I can say, get used to it. Okay, but this is certainly makes Darwin well aware, and it's time to pick up the pace. So he decides not to finish his huge book, but to write something that's more compact about the origin of species. And about 18 months later, this book appears, the book we all know. And now everybody pays attention. Well, why? Well, lots of reasons, but one is, it was really written for anyone who was inclined to read it. It's extremely readable, still readable today. It marshaled 23 years of evidence that Darwin was working on. A lot of us think it was argued very clearly and persuasively, with Darwin arguing both sides of the argument, saying, this is what I think, but here's the things that would smash my theory to bits. And this, of course, heralded the end of special creation and a revolutionary new view of nature. And it was accepted worldwide instantly, and we've been happy ever since. But it set the agenda for our field for the next 150 years and beyond. And one of the immediate questions it raised was about this new idea of natural selection. Is natural selection strong and sensitive enough to shape the fine differences among species? So serious naturalists had to deal with the ideas that Darwin raised and say, okay, where's the evidence and what should we be working on? And fortunate timing, this is November 1859. A few months earlier that year, remember our old friend, Henry Walter Bates? Well, he dragged his rather dilapidated body out of the Amazon, hopped on a boat, and came home after 11 years in the Amazon, 10 on his own, collecting 14,000 plus species in all, more than 8,000 new to science. Remember, pure amateur. He finished schooling also at age 13. So he gets back home. There's no job waiting for him. Nothing. He actually has to move back in with his family in Leicester. Figure this, right? Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. Yeah, I've been away 11 years. Are the posters still on my wall? He has to move back in with his family. But a little bit later, as he's organizing his specimens, Darwin's great book appears. And he realizes it gives him a framework for everything he's seen in the Amazon. And more than that, he realizes he observed some things that Darwin had not noted. So he strikes up a correspondence with Darwin saying, I think I've got a glimpse into the laboratory where nature manufactures her new species. Oh, this is music to Darwin's ears. He's taking a beating over the origin of species, both signed in anonymous reviews, cartoons, just calling them everything in the book, right? So here's a naturalist with 11 years of experience in the Amazon saying, Mr. Darwin, I've got some new things to show you. So he's eager. Bates, Mr. Bates, please, share. Well, what did Bates notice? What he noticed was that he often saw completely harmless creatures that resembled noxious, nasty, or poisonous things. Things like, a beetle like this that in some way resembled things like a wasp. Or this caterpillar, where one end of it so looked like a small pit viper that when he carried it into a village, all the villagers ran off. And he was thinking about, why would you have these resemblances in nature? Now, he was feeling a little bit discouraged not having a job, but Darwin was rooting him on, encouraging him to publish his observations in scientific journals. And of all the creatures Bates saw in the Amazon, none left a greater impression on him than the butterflies. And he found a lot of butterflies. In one area alone, 550 species, more than all the species in Europe. And what Bates observed, just taking these two pairs of butterflies, for example, was quite curious. First glance, you'd look at these things, and you'd imagine these two butterflies were closely related, and these two butterflies were closely related. But we'd all be wrong. It's these two butterflies that belong to the same family, and these two butterflies that belong to an entirely different family. And what Bates caught on to was that this butterfly was, for some reason, resembling another member of another family. And same with this one. And he figured out why. Because when he handled these two butterflies, he saw they gave off some kind of noxious substance. And furthermore, when he dried them on his specimen table, birds didn't come by and grab them, lizards didn't come up and take them, and when they were flying through the forest, birds didn't chase them. So I realized that, wait a second, these are noxious, but these butterflies didn't give off any kind of substance in his hands or anything like that, but he thought, they're gaining some protection by resembling nasty, distasteful butterflies. And furthermore, when he looked carefully, he saw that, well, some of these butterflies closely resemble what we refer to as the model, but some don't. And that natural variability told him that this was a natural process. These butterflies weren't stamped out like toys from a press. They were variable. And that told him that this variation was natural. And so what he concluded was that to exist at all in a given locality, our leptalis, which are these species, she must wear a certain dress, and those of its varieties that do not come up to the mark are rigidly sacrificed, those that are not good mimics. And I believe the case offers the most beautiful proof of the theory of natural selection. One species whose variants were being selected to resemble another species, that natural selection was strong and sensitive enough to sculpt the fine features that he saw in species. You know who else thought it was a beautiful proof of natural selection? His buddy, Mr. Darwin, who wrote him this letter and said, on the publication of the paper, in my opinion, it is one of the most remarkable and admirable papers I ever read in my life. I know we all feel the same about people who agree with us 100%. So what we still refer to today as Batesian mimicry, the imitation of one species by another, became crucial evidence in support of the theory. How else would you explain these resemblances? Because Bates pointed out this is not coincidence. It only occurs where the species overlap in the same district. It's not like he was looking at butterflies from northern and southern Brazil and, in his crate and saying, oh, look, they look a lot alike. That resemblance only occurred where the species overlapped. So this was 1862, which turned out to be the very same year that Wallace finally came home from the Malay Archipelago. Now, these three explorers, and I want to also emphasize, they were young men when they left. They were still young men when they got back. This is how you normally see them in their iconic phase. But these three explorers had great admiration for one another, and they were lifelong friends who promoted the theory of evolution. And their voyages and their work and their insights mark a golden age of evolutionary biology. But the last thing I'd want to suggest is that the great adventures were over, far from it. So much more to explore and to be discovered, particularly in the fossil record. And I think for $15 you can read more about those adventures. And help send a kid to college. But moreover, I submit that right now today we're in a second golden age of evolutionary science. And it's one where we're no longer restricted to just looking at remarkable creatures, but we can see how they're made and how they've evolved. We're getting glimpses from the laboratory into how new species are made. And modern biologists, we're collectors too, putting together menageries much like the one Wallace tried to bring home from the Amazon. We've got, sloths and armadillos and platypus and wallabies, chimpanzees. Only we're not taking them to the zoo and we're not stuffing them and putting them in natural history museums. We're taking their DNA. And from that, we're reconstructing the tree of life. We're deciphering how the fittest are made, how the great physical diversity of living forms have evolved. We've got 52 mammal sequences right now, and over 2,000 other species deciphered. And as we mine this massive record, which is growing enormously every day, as one of the indoor biologists, mining this record, I'm going to say that we share the same sense of wonder and surprise and discovery as the pioneers I've told you about. Only we don't have to barf our way to work as Darwin did, or cope with malaria, or headhunters. Just peer review. It's another form of cannibalism. And yeah, amen, huh? And we no longer stare at creatures, like this gorgeous butterfly, just mesmerized by its external beauty, because we can now see the genes in action that are responsible for making these forms and for making diverse forms. And what could be better than fossils, like these various fossils that Darwin collected, sketches of these fossils that Darwin collected? Well, how about DNA from fossils? A whole new way of peering into the past that not only Darwin didn't imagine, but really most modern biologists didn't think was going to be very fruitful until very recently. But those tales are not only for another day, those tales are, of course, what's making up a lot of this meeting. And my goal tonight was really to highlight where this all started. And among the past adventurers, the one we celebrate the most is Darwin. Now, why is that? Now, you all might have your own personal reasons or disagreement, but we're going with it for now. And I want to give Wallace the last word on that. Lots of speculation. Wallace outlived Darwin by 30 years. But he's been gone for a century, and a lot of speculation, was Wallace treated fairly, etc. Well, let me show you what Wallace really felt. And I think the way to know how Wallace really felt about things, and especially felt about Darwin, is to look into his correspondence, in fact, his private correspondence. Letters he wrote that he never expected some idiot from Wisconsin to show you 150 years later. And here's the letter, and the context is really important. Darwin, when he published On the Origin of Species, he sent a copy to Wallace in the Malay Archipelago. And now Wallace, who stayed in touch with Bates all the way through his travels, is now back on Ternate. He often crisscrossed and came back to the same island more than once. He's on Ternate on Christmas Eve, 1860, and he's writing this letter to Bates. You may also notice that Wallace has beautiful, legible handwriting. And he's going to give his assessment of having read The Origin of Species. And we have this copy. We have Wallace's copy, again, in the museum in London, and with all of its margin notes. And I have to tell you, some of those margin notes are yes, 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 5 exclamation points, etc. All right, so here's what Wallace had to say about Darwin and Darwin's book. He says, "I know not how or to whom to express fully my admiration for Darwin's book, its overwhelming argument, and its admirable tone and spirit. Mr. Darwin has created a new science and a new philosophy, and I believe that never has such a complete illustration of a new branch of human knowledge been due to the labors and researches of a single man." When you're having a bad day, it's nice to look at something like that and realize that it's probably one of the most generous letters I've seen in the scientific, history of science. But this is truly how he felt. Everything he said and did for the next 50 years was consistent with this sentiment. He said it many times in private correspondence to other friends. He dedicated his book on the Malay Archipelago to Darwin. So that's how Wallace felt. That was his true feelings. And of course, Darwin produced much more than On the Origin of Species, The Descent of Man, the idea of sexual selection, tomes on the variation and domestication of animals and plants, books on orchids, earthworms, the first correct theory on the formation of coral reefs. So no doubt our greatest naturalist, and that's why we celebrate. So if I can have the lights down, I want to just close with a couple of thoughts and really tell you, why did I tell you these stories? And I told you these stories because my hope is that many more people will come to appreciate the great spirit that drove young Charles and Alfred and Henry and so many other men and women to leave behind their loved ones, risk their health, their lives, all to explore the unknown. And second, that many more people will come to embrace the beauty of the story of life that they and we, their descendants, have put together. Thank you all for coming. Have a great meeting.